For interviews on educational technology and for a list of our educational technology workshops, please visit www.edtechlive.com. And for discounted Dell computers, please visit our sponsor, www.k12computers.com. Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's Monday, March 19th, 2007, and my guest tonight is Brian Behlendorf. Brian, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, that's great.
Brian is one of the primary developers of the Apache web server. Brian, thanks for being on the call.
Sure.
Brian, can you tell me a little bit about what Apache is and what it does?
Sure. Well, the way that I would prefer to kind of describe it is that it's more than just about a web server these days. There is an organization called the Apache Software Foundation. It's a nonprofit, registered as what they call a 501c3, which means you can make donations to it that are tax deductible. And the Apache Software Foundation acts as a home for a series of different projects. There's about 40 or so different top-level projects, as we call them. And one of those is the web server project that kicked it all off back in 1995. But since then, it's grown to lots of other Java-related and XML-related technologies. As a nonprofit, it doesn't employ anyone. It actually is an all-volunteer nonprofit. And all the volunteers are people who work for different companies in the technology space. Sometimes they are software companies, like big companies like IBM and Sun or Google, small companies that are just starting up, or even consultancies. And sometimes it's people just, hacking on software for the fun of it, learning how it works and trying to make it do something interesting. But people volunteer and organize around these different projects. And the foundation exists to give them a home for those efforts, to help them with the legal issues related to distributing that software and helping people understand what open source is, and all that.
So, Brian, I've noticed that you use the phrase open source, and those who've listened to the podcast series have heard Eric Raymond talk about the phrasing there, and I've heard Richard Stallman talk about it. Can you tell me a little bit about your perceptions of the use of that phrase, and is it important to you to call it free software or open source software?
Right. Well, free software has existed as long as, I'm sure you've gone through the history before, back to the 80s, back to the founding of the Free Software Foundation, et cetera. And in some ways, we've had it as long as we've had the Internet, because the Internet came about from software being developed by people at different universities and even different corporations building common networking technologies around TCP/IP and other protocols. And in many cases, the software that spoke those protocols were released under a very liberal license. The original Berkeley Unix, as they called it, was an implementation of a lot of these that had been not just widely distributed so that academics could discuss and improve and try out new ideas, but also widely incorporated into products from everybody from Cisco to Sun to even Microsoft. And so the history of free software, is not just the Free Software Foundation. It's also, in many ways, this history of the Internet, of this sharing of code, and in that tradition, in 1995. Was when the Apache Software Project was started, and it really was started by a group of webmasters who were using a university-based, university-authored web server that came from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The same group that put out the original Mosaic web browser also had a web server that they'd put out that was a much simpler product. It was, a couple of undergrad students who had worked on it, but it worked well enough for the first wave of websites. But it needed improvement. It needed additions to keep up with the state of the art and technology, because it was the very early days of the web, and so new ideas like being able to log into a website and to use cookies and support other types of media and such like that. It required extending the server in interesting ways. And Apache really got started when a group of us as webmasters decided to get together and improve that original server from NCSA. And the licensing that allowed that was key. It wasn't just a piece of software that we decided to pick up and because we didn't think anyone else was interested. It's not something we found on the floor. It's something that was released with a copyright license that said this code is public domain. Do whatever you want with it. Improve it. Fix bugs in it, and you can even share those improvements with other people. Right. So that copyright license was kind of the key to Apache getting started. And that what's sometimes called the right to fork, the right to be able to take a piece of software, improve it, and release it yourself or release it with some other people in a different direction than where it originally came from. This right to fork is what really came to be a key part in 1998 of the open source definition. And 98 was really the watershed year for the definition of open source as a phenomenon that spanned not just what was going on at Apache, not just what was going on at the Free Software Foundation, but also with Linux, also with Mozilla, the new web browser, the open sourcing of Netscape's web browser, and many, many other activities that until that point didn't really have a good term for them.
So I think people in the school environment feel a little bit overwhelmed with the whole licensing discussion in open source software. But to me, I think that maybe there are two areas in which we can identify that are helpful. One is certainly that the software is free to distribute, meaning that it can be something like OpenOffice or Firefox can be given to students or used at schools freely without having to worry about paying licensing fees to someone.
That's correct.
I think that resonates with those in the education world. The other aspect is the ability to actually look at the code, and I'm not quite sure how much this is actually done, but it does seem to me that the ability to tinker and to get in and play with the code would make a significant difference for the teaching of software development.
It's funny. When I was in computer science classes at UC Berkeley, the emphasis was on, reading the books that described, the programming languages or the programming algorithms in English, and then, being given the task to write entirely by yourself, the code that implements those ideas. And in the real software world, rarely are you writing whole cloth big sections of code from scratch. Often, especially if you're good, you're going to be reusing what came before. Because rarely are you the first person to have tried, anything non-trivial. And most people in the software industry end up learning software engineering by observation, by watching what other people do. And open source is useful from this, not just from the perspective of releasing, of the fact that the source code is available for inspection, but that would almost be meaningless without something else really important, which is the community of developers who wrote that code also carrying on their conversations and their development process in a public forum, right? Most well-run open source projects, all of their development will take place on a mailing list or via some web-based boards or between blogs. I mean, all of these in ways which are visible to the outside world. And many open source projects will have, a half dozen or a dozen kind of very active developers and hundreds and sometimes even thousands of people sitting there watching them do their development, almost like they're fans in a sporting stadium. It's that essential back and forth between engineers, the deliberations between the right way to build things, the peer review that comes from the feedback that developers get when they propose a change to the code. All of that is where, for myself, I can speak for myself there, but also for other people, that's where some real learning can take place about how to really write this code and also what this code means, what the source code to this is all about.
I think that there's an intuitive sense that, or at least I have a sense that intuitively makes sense. I can't imagine going into a shop, auto shop class, and not actually being able to work on the engine, having
right.
to build an engine from scratch. Interesting to me is to watch what seems to be kind of an evolution from open source software, which really has formed, it appears to me in a lot of ways, the backbone of Web 2.0, not just from the software side, but also maybe from the idea side.
Mm-hmm.
And then to see some of these things, the peer production and the collaboration that we have associated with open source software occurring in fields that are very non-technical. Maybe blogging being an example of that.
Or the Wikipedia.
Or Wikipedia. That's a better one. And interesting to me is that I think there is sort of a growing interest in the educational philosophy or understanding of people working together and collaborating that I think has kind of come from the open source arena.
I think with open source we have the most successful example of how communities online can get together and create, useful things that have a life well beyond just the immediate members of that community, right? I mean, there's electronic communities around lots of different topics, lots of different ideas, but what's getting created in these open source communities is living well beyond the community that wrote it. And that's true for the Wikipedia as well. A lot of people have value now from the Wikipedia who've not been a part of the community that created it, but we're starting to see this really neat phenomenon take place, and there are people definitely trying to understand how is it that these communities form. I mean, often they're in very lightweight kinds of almost it's almost a stretch in some cases to call them a community, right? Because people can join these different mailing lists, these different projects very easily. Somebody from Slovenia might find a bug in a project, submit a patch, and then are they part of that community? I think so. What many people are studying are the ways in which all of this activity is organized, the way that quality can be maintained. There's lots of famous examples of the Wikipedia being, corrupted, right? Stephen Colbert being perhaps the most famous example of that. But most of these kinds of projects, and this is especially true for open source, have pretty significant levels of quality assurance, that get applied, and massive peer review that get applied before changes go into the code. And there's some other angles to this too, I think, that are really captured by the idea of transparency. If you can see, the wizard behind the drapes, controlling how things are working, right? If you're in that 1% of the people who want to understand how something happens and want to get more information, and if it's possible for you to cross that chasm from being just a consumer of information and a consumer of ideas into somebody who is actually contributing or participating, that's what these new technologies are enabling, and the new phenomenon is enabling. And it doesn't have to be limited to software. Software has some nice features about it that make it pretty easy to compare to test the quality of compared to, say, encyclopedia entries. But the potential is there, and I would say in almost any industry to reinvent it on the terms of methods of peer production, very much like open source. And I think education would be, especially around textbooks, I'd say it would be there's a lot of potential there for teachers to be able to work with other teachers, to be able to work with college level academics and researchers in the field, even other professionals, to come up with content that can rival the best of what gets created by one person or a small team of people at a publisher. And then we don't have to pay $80 per textbook, right? I mean, it's such a ripe place for this kind of transformation, and there are quite a few groups working on this right now.
I think you're exactly right. And what's interesting to me is you don't even have to go very deep into it to just see students getting very engaged when they're actually participating in the production of something, and where the learning takes place in the course of producing something that they're doing with others, where there's a lot of feedback that comes besides just from the teacher. Mm-hmm. So How successful is Apache?
So it's difficult to measure that sometimes. I mean, there is one measure that is widely cited, which is there's a survey that's done every month of every website in existence that, is an automated robot kind of survey that basically asks the website, what web server software are you running, and there's a standard way to report that, and so it does every month there's these statistics that come out, and it's almost like a ranking, right? And Apache very early on, around 1998, hit over 50% of the installed base of the web, based on on a per server per website basis, and it's kept to between 50 and 70% for ever since then. So that project within Apache is pretty successful. Other projects like Tomcat and Xerxes and Xalen, which are these XML engines, and others are hard to tell how popular they are because they can get so embedded inside of other people's applications, right? And the same thing is true with most of the open source software out there. It's really difficult to get a sense of how widely they're used. We know we're making a difference, though, when when the development around each of these projects has dozens to hundreds to thousands of people involved in them. When the number of downloads hits in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, and downloads are even hard to tell because there's over 200 mirror sites out there for the Apache website itself. The Apache.org website. There's just it's widely mirrored, and we don't collect the logs from those. And so it's very widespread, though. One thing you could also look at is how many resumes of people in the technology industry cite Apache-related technologies, or Linux-related technologies, etc. It used to be that it was all overwhelmingly Microsoft because that's what people were hiring for. These days, any competent programmer is going to be listing familiarity with Linux, familiarity with Apache-related technologies. Especially if they're a Java programmer, they'll be listing out their favorite Apache Java packages and things like that. So. Which kind of brings up this interesting angle too, where open source has kind of become involvement in open source projects has become a new form of resume for people in the technology sector. Where rather than providing a list of here's the schools I attended and the grades I got, at my company, CollabNet, when we hire people, we evaluate not just that training, but also what projects they've been on, because if they can say I'm a volunteer on the Velocity project at Apache, we can go to that project, we can look for that person's name, we can see their communication style, we can see the quality of the code that they create, we can see all the different things that matter to making for a quality engineer, or a high quality engineer for the company. So it's this ties into the theme of this almost also being a new way for people to kind of educate themselves on how to be programmers. But it's a significant thing.
Well, the reason I ask that question is that I typically will tell people that Apache, from the estimates that I see, runs about 70% of the world's web servers. Mm-hmm. When I say that, am I being close to accurate?
You are, yeah.
And what's intriguing to me is that I have not yet met anybody who's teaching Apache in schools. Mm-hmm. Can you correct that? Do you know that it's being taught anywhere widely?
Well, one of the things is that as a web server, it's installed by default now on any Unix-based operating system. Anybody who has a Mac also has a copy of the Apache web server. But when they set up web hosting on their Mac, they follow through a bunch of screens, and they might not even realize it's Apache running underneath. What you probably do see are people teaching classes in PHP, right, or Python, or server-side Java programming. Apache by itself is relatively, the web server is relatively straightforward to set up. There are definitely, I've seen training courses, kind of at the corporate level. I haven't seen undergraduate courses kind of just focused on Apache-related technologies, but I think any course that focuses on how to set up a website, or even beyond that, how to be a website administrator, will probably include a fair bit of discussion about the web server and how best to configure it, how best to tune it, that kind of thing. But in many ways, it just works right out of the box for people. It's these other technologies, server-side Java, PHP, that end up being the place where people really need more help.
I'll be interested to see if we get response to this part of the dialogue, because there is a teacher in Virginia, Jeff Elkner, who uses Python and teaches his high school students Python, and they run a Linux lab. And he's really pretty unique. But what was interesting to me was that having met his students who came to help at NECC in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, was the clear degree to which they were self-motivated, self-learners, and I think one of them, even right out of high school, was offered a job at Ubuntu. And I had the sense that they had really learned something and were very accomplished. And I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush, but I've wondered if maybe that's just not happening very, very frequently. That the ability to actually get in and look at the code and learn what's going on is maybe more rare than it should be.
I certainly think that code can be pretty daunting. Code that, there's a lot of engineers who, when presented with somebody else's code and told to fix it, are more likely to throw it out and start over fresh than to try to understand what somebody else wrote. And part of that is because certain programming languages allow such a diversity of style to how they're written, and there isn't really a strunk and white equivalent for a lot of programming languages. It's funny, I think some of the best programmers that I've hired have been English majors, actually, in their ability to craft thoughts and clearly communicate them, and who value being concise as well. So reading other people's code can be painful, and people will tend not to just do that in isolation. Participating in projects, though, is something that we see. So there was one of the early developers on Apache, this guy named Alexei Kosut, was very active, contributing patches, commenting on other people's patches, adding features here and there, and active for a couple of years. And then one day he sends a note that says, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to take some time off from. You're not going to see as much of me. It's because I'm starting my freshman year at Stanford." And this was after having been a contributor for 3 or 4 years. He was leaving us to go. He had just completed high school and was just about to go be a freshman at Stanford. So that, and I cite that not as a common case. That's certainly a special case, but the potential is there, And I remember in being in high school and not quite having the internet yet at that point. This was late '80s, but loving the stuff that I could download from a BBS and try using, and there's that spirit of kind of playfulness that open source kind of meshes with really well. That if we can get students to be inspired to play with technologies, to get their hands dirty with it, so much of what passes for technology amongst students these days is, things that are just, so complicated that there isn't really even much hope to get involved. It's like no student today thinks about, gee, why don't I go off and write my own video game for the Wii or for the Xbox, right? Those environments don't make it easy for people to write simple games or interesting games themselves. You have to be a professional video game developer and pay them for certification and all that kind of stuff. But in the '80s, in the early days of computing, there wasn't very much software. You kind of had your basic compiler, and you had Logo, and you had a few other things, and so it was a much more tractable technology. You could actually, as a as a high school student, you could get in and see how things worked and write your own programs, or even as grade school. And there was that spirit of kind of playfulness that we need to find again with technology. We need to find again with software if we're going to recapture the lead. And unfortunately, we've been losing quite a bit of enrollment in computer science in American universities over the last few years, as I understand it. And I think it's because technology has gotten daunting for the average student. There isn't that place to learn and figure out how to get productive. And websites are kind of the return of that. If the teachers out there who are, of classes, whether official classes or after-school classes, teaching students how to build websites, is where we might see that kind of thing again. Where I think we do see that. Because finally it's a technology people can get invested in, and so I think it's actually important that we get students to move away from, thinking that they're setting up a web presence by creating a MySpace page, which isn't really doing much, and instead encourage them to think about how can I take this computer in front of me and use it to be my voice on the web, and my presence on the web, and communicate things about me and help me harness information that's out there. It's a big potential that now, thanks to Web 2.0 and to open source, I think we have.
I would agree with you, and at least from my limited view, it seems to me that Web 2.0 has the potential to draw people into that playfulness. The ability to fairly simply do a mashup and bring data from one subset to another and to combine them is a tinkering, as John C. Brown called it.
Right.
It really hasn't been available as much, and may draw people who are inclined a little bit deeper. And I would have to imagine that most of that does take place outside of the sort of the formal structure of education. That it is sort of, you have to be kind of a self-learner to get involved in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would put it in the same bucket as woodshop. It's kind of, here's stuff that's useful to know that you might, it may or may not be related to whatever career you choose down the road. It's not horribly abstract. It's pretty much in the here and now, but you can use it to build things. And actually, there's this great book by this MIT professor named Neil Gershenfeld, and the book is simply called Fab, F-A-B. And Neil has focused on the importance. Well, what he's done is he's put together a bunch of manufacturing devices, things for being able to build everything from large-scale devices down to electronic circuits down to nanotech, and he's put them in shipping containers, and put these containers into. He put it into Gambia, put one into inner city Boston. And he's staffed them with people who, are there to help teach people, whether it's kids or even adults, how to use these tools to manufacture things, right, and to be creative. And he's got some great testimony. It's on I think it's fab.mit.edu, fab.mit.edu, on people who have done interesting things with these tools of manufacturing, based purely upon ideas. And based purely upon common designs that are freely licensed and being able to build on top of them. And so yeah, this idea of teaching enough of the kind of tools of a given trade to unlock some of that creativity inside of people, inside of students, and get them, past that daunting kind of, wow, this technology is really hard, and into a space, into a mindset where they can not just be productive with it, but creating things we haven't heard of. I mean, every year there's new things in the Intel Science Fair that are graduate level research projects, and some the winners of those can really make a difference. And I think students need to be told that the shackles are off in a way, and go and be creative.
Certainly the hardest part of that will be that those who were most in a position to provide that for the students probably feel the least confident in their ability to do so. And what Jeff Elkner, I think, has done so well is the one who teaches Python and PHP and Apache, is he's basically said to his students, you're going to know more than I will. And most of my former students know more than I do. So let's get together and figure out what would be interesting and valuable to learn this year, and then I'll facilitate it. But he's pretty clear about the fact that they're going to pretty quickly pass him up in terms of their understanding.
Well, I mean that sounds like the right approach, definitely.
Well, it's got to be hard to have to say, if your average teacher's taught computer science for 10 or 15 years or whatever that figure might be, that they've probably been largely in an environment which has not provided those tools. That brings me kind of to a little bit of a tangent, but I'll probably worth bringing up. It seems to me that as I go to these educational technology shows, that one of the things that's really hard for people to understand about open source software is just the way it's financed. Because they're used to going to a show and seeing corporations actively market to schools. And a question that will often come up when I'm talking about open source software is, when are they going to get paid? I know it's free to use now, but at some point in time, aren't they going to create a revenue stream where we've bought into the program and now we're going to be responsible for paying out?
Right.
So you're, if my math is right, you're almost about to turn 34.
Mm-hmm.
Am I close?
Yeah.
And you've been significantly involved in Apache, and it's obviously played a significant role in the development of what we see as internet technologies. So you must be super rich and probably spend half of your year on a beach somewhere on an island that you bought, right?
Not from Apache, that's for sure. No, I mentioned earlier that the Apache Software Foundation has no employees, right? And from its inception to its current incarnation, the people who volunteer to work on Apache, are in some cases pure volunteers. They're doing it outside of their day-to-day commercial interest, but the vast majority work on these technologies because their day job depends upon them in some critical way, right? I was a webmaster first for Wired magazine, and then for a company I started called Organic that built websites, some of the first websites for like Harley Davidson, Levi's, Nike, kind of these big brand name companies. And then the company I started in 1999 called CollabNet. These are all of these were companies that needed a better web server, right? And in whose interests I could justify spending time, because it wasn't full-time on my part, and rarely is it full-time on others, improving this common technology, right? And this pattern of people who decide to work together to kind of solve some common problems, so that they can also go compete on different areas, is something that's been repeating in the software industry for a long time. And it's a pattern that's pretty stable, because generally, as I was saying, any technology problem has probably been attacked by at least one other person before, and finding that code and working with somebody else to kind of come up with a good, that common body of code is going to be more efficient than trying to write it yourself, or to go pay someone else for it. Now, that's not universally true. There are some pieces of code not yet written, and there's some ideas that you might have that might be genuinely brand new ideas. Most of the companies in the technology industry who dabble in open source might also have commercial products that they sell. And IBM is probably the canonical example of this, where they have some very expensive commercial enterprise software that they sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars each, but they give away other software, and they can also contribute heavily to the creation of Apache. And so it's this kind of enlightened self-interest, this kind of balance between commonality and differentiation. My own company, CollabNet, we funded from inception this open source project named Subversion, which was a kind of a workflow or a code basically like a library, time machine, if you will, for software source code. And we make money from it by selling support contracts. A big company doesn't want to use Subversion without paying somebody they can call on if they don't understand something. We also sell training as well, but there's also free resources out there for people to understand how the code works, to support themselves, that kind of thing. And for us, we do compete against other commercial players who sell traditional licensed software, but the dynamics of open source, where this Subversion package can get out there, widely promulgated, included now by default in Red Hat and many other Linux distributions, still allows us to build a business on top of it in support and training, and then we even have some additional commercially licensed products that Subversion helps enable a market for. So most of the players, and this is how most people get paid to write the software. It's not truly altruism; it's enlightened self-interest that makes it work. But in some cases, there is some altruism, and it's interesting to kind of anthropologically to chart this. But I think at its root, it's still about enlightened self-interest by a lot of different players.
Well, certainly, I think it has the potential, and actually is transforming education in some very positive ways. I think for a long time we've wanted to find ways to provide the best of opportunities in K-12 education, but haven't had a really good financial model for doing it in a way that allowed schools to make progress without depleting other programs.
Right.
And I often will talk about the fact that OpenOffice, whether or not it gets adopted by a school district, will and is having the effect of lowering the cost of basic office productivity software for schools. Mm-hmm. And that really should be the case. It really should be that there should not be a financial burden associated with one aspect of schooling that so depletes the opportunities in other areas that you would have to cancel band and choir in order to fund your computer lab.
Absolutely.
And I really like the direction, and I think I'm also kind of intrigued by the degree to which now I kind of take it as a given that in order to get my attention as a consumer, that I will be able to use a program and to have some basic functionality available to me before the company puts me in a position to make a choice about whether or not to continue to go further, mm-hmm. because that just seems to me to be so healthy, right. and so different than it felt, as a business owner 10 or 15 years ago, when you sort of had to kind of close your eyes and plunk your money down, and you really weren't sure what you were going to get, and, mm-hmm. and how long it was going to lock you in.
Right. No, and I think what we still need to see in the K-12 industry are the technology providers to this industry. I think they are naturally very more conservative, perhaps in their technology choices. But I think economics are going to force them to become wise to open source, to start offering, for example, support plans for OpenOffice. Where, this is one of the brilliant things about open source, is that I could myself today decide to start a support company for OpenOffice, right? Where I would go and tell people, hey, I'll, for $10 a year per installed copy, I will be willing to answer your questions with a 2-day turnaround time or something like that, right? Or I could go and I could lead classes on here's how to get the best out of OpenOffice, right? And so the potential is there, I think, for the industry of technology providers to the K-12 market. Everyone from consultants to the existing companies selling educational software to reinvent themselves as service providers from a commodity technology base, something where the bits are shared and the companies compete on the quality of the services they provide and how much they can tailor it to a particular district, or geography probably matters there too, that kind of thing.
Does it occur to you that what we're seeing is a social and economic change that's pretty dramatic?
Oh, I think we have the internet to thank for that, and it's hard to tell whether the pace, which certainly seems fast, if that's a pace that is unusual given how radically things have been changing each decade of the last 50, and each decade of the last century anyways, right? The Internet was a pretty earth-shaking change in cutting the cost of communications to essentially zero, in rendering geography as much less important to the formation of groups and the formation of social connections and things like that. And I think this is an aftershock of that big quake. I think we all knew the Internet was going to change a lot about how commerce gets conducted as well, and how reputations get built, and how people communicate with each other. And so I think it's a continuation of that, any more so than it's its own economic phenomenon. But today, if you are in the software space and you're not thinking about open source software, either in the form of using it to compete against your competitors, or the fact that somebody might use it against you, then you're not paying attention if you're not thinking about open source in that context. If you are a technology buyer and you're not researching the open source options, you are not performing your due diligence. So this stuff is becoming real now. There's open source software in pretty much every sector, from medical office management software to supply chain software to consumer software. And there's also the security angle as well. If you're still using Internet Explorer and Outlook, you are still vulnerable. Last year, according to this security research that was done, if you used Microsoft's Internet Explorer and Outlook, you were vulnerable to known exploits, known viruses, known problems that were unpatched for something like 300 days out of 365. It's just, there's the security argument alone for switching to open source software. But in terms of the industry, yeah, it really is shaking things up, and it's a disruptive change, the way that the classic innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen described in a disruptive change in a lot of other industries, and this is one for the software industry.
Brian, what operating system do you run on your computer?
I actually run FreeBSD, which is kind of a cousin to Linux. Its lineage goes all the way back to the original Berkeley Unix from the 70s and 80s. It's kind of a hacker's platform, just kind of something I grew up with and came to trust quite a bit. Though I also run Ubuntu on a couple other systems. And as time goes on, I kind of like running two different operating systems to keep myself kind of grounded and familiar with the differences. I would certainly, not recommend for the majority of other people that they run, FreeBSD. For the majority of others, I'd recommend either Ubuntu or Mac OS X.
How do you check your email?
I use an old-time, this is kind of embarrassing, an old-time mail program called Pine, which, was pretty popular in its day. I probably will make the switch to Thunderbird at some point soon, because I really am starting to need multiple panes open at once. But I use Pine.
What web browser?
Firefox, of course.
Of course. Who do you listen to? What voices in the technical world are you paying attention to?
Well, I read Slashdot. I actually wrote a script to email me Slashdot stories, kind of one by one, stripping out the comments, of course. and while it's probably got some, they tend to duplicate stories here and there, and have some other issues. But by and large, they tend to be a pretty good sweep of this intersection between open source, technology in general, but also public policy. So I read that, or read Boing Boing, which is a blog that's pretty popular out there. I read Larry Lessig's blog. Larry Lessig is the founder of the Creative Commons. He's a law professor at Stanford. and very, very useful stuff to read. I also have other non-technology interests, like I read The Economist and read Salon, which is an online publication, but I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a chance to get to know you a little bit better.
Oh, okay. Salon in particular, there's a blog called How the World Works, which is written by Andrew Leonard, and he is really kind of an econ geek, but he's really looking at this intersection between globalization, open source in a way, alternative fuels, which are kind of shaping up to be the next hot technology sector for the Bay Area, but also a place where open source might be able to help quite a bit. Basically, it's a blog with these different stories about China, different stories about intellectual property. But he finds these interesting correlations and these interesting connections. And so, anyone for a fan who's a fan of James Burke's Connections series, which I loved when I was a kid, and I saw that it was a PBS special, if you remember, I would probably like this blog.
Very good. I'll look them up. What's on your nightstand? What do you like to free read? Like I said, The Economist and I guess Rolling Stone and Wire, which is the Wire, which is another music magazine. I'm trying to think of what books I've been reading recently. I read a book by Hernando de Soto called The Other Path. Hernando de Soto is a economist who writes a lot about how to address the challenges of the third world, and believes giving them property rights might be a way to do that. Yeah. Okay, so we spent about 50 minutes talking about open source and education, and you prefaced actually before we started the conversation, you said you weren't sure you had really thought too much about open source and K-12 education. Through the course of this time, has anything occurred to you related to your own schooling or to K-12 education that you think would be worth looking into based on some of the things we've talked about? Any last ideas of things that I should be looking at as I continue to pursue this dialogue? Well,
I think the potential for open source to be kind of the reason, a spark to ignite some excitement amongst students in getting to know more about technology, getting their hands dirty with it, understanding how to change it, is there. And I think one way to phrase what might be needed would be to think about a MySpace for the technologically inclined student, a place where students could come and discover the kinds of open source software that exists, but then also start to play with it and start to share kind of how they're using it and what they're building with it with other students, and to find other people, at their school, but also worldwide that they could, work on creatively experiment with. I mean, even back to like third grade, what I loved doing, took computer science, kind of classes at our lab, and all we had was logo, right? And everyone liked writing logo to draw little interesting pictures and show them off and things like that. Some with the technology we have today, we can have students sharing those with lots of different people, right? And the success of MySpace has shown that if you give people kids a tool to be able to share their ideas and share kind of their personality with other people, then it'll get used, right? And if we can make programming fun, if we can make it so it's not seen as just being about having is equivalent to having a career as an accountant or something like that, then I think we could really do something there. The other is just that if I had more time, if I had more ability, I'd love to get involved in the open source textbook kind of thing, because I really do think that's could shake things up in a very positive way for educators out there.
Well, it sure seems like if we've seen the commoditization of PC hardware, and then we're seeing the commoditization of software, it does seem like the commoditization of information will hold similar kinds of opportunities?
The word commoditization is strange, right? Because you can definitely describe PC hardware and other types of hardware as being turned into a commodity, but software and information is not like a 60-gallon bushel of grain. It's not. Software can be so different, and information can be different. I think what is true is that old refrain: information wants to be free, and information also wants to be shared. And finding structures to be able to enable that is probably the most important thing we can be doing. Enable it to be shared as well as collaboratively developed and extended.
I think that's a great note on which to finish.
Cool.
Brian, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.